The widow's trembling hands shielded her starving children as she faced the scarred Apache warrior whose territory they had violated. Running Bear raised his knife, never suspecting these desperate intruders would shatter the fortress of solitude he'd built around his heart after watching everyone he loved die. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The wind howled across the rugged Arizona mountains, carrying with it the scent of pine and sage as Running Bear sat alone at the entrance of his modest shelter. His weathered hands worked methodically on the deer hide stretched before him, the repetitive motion a familiar comfort in a life defined by solitude. At 32, he had lived longer than many of his people, surviving the wars, diseases, and hardships that had decimated his tribe. The dying embers of his fire cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a permanent reminder of a battle from which few had returned. His dark eyes, once alight with the fire of youth, now carried the weight of countless losses. Another night, he murmured to himself in Apache, a language he rarely spoke aloud anymore. There was no one left to hear it. Running Bear had made his peace with loneliness years ago, after his band was scattered and most killed in a territorial conflict with the Bluecoats. He had wandered alone, avoiding the reservations and the white settlements alike. He had built this shelter high in the mountains, where few travelers ventured. Here, between earth and sky, he lived by his own rules, answering to no one. He had never taken a wife, never known the comfort of children's laughter filling his home. The women of his tribe had been taken or killed before he reached the age of courtship, and afterward there seemed little point in seeking such connections. The distant sound of thunder rumbled across the valley, promising rain by morning. Running Bear secured the hide and added wood to the fire, preparing for the long night ahead. The flames leapt higher, casting his shadow against the rock face behind him. One shadow. Always. Just one. He was about to retreat into his shelter when another sound caught his attention. Not thunder, not wind. The sound of voices, high, distressed human voices, carrying through the darkness. Running Bear reached for his rifle, a well-maintained Winchester he had taken from a trader years ago. He moved silently, melting into the shadows of the pine trees that surrounded his camp. The voices grew closer, a woman's voice, strained and fearful, and the whimpering cries of children, white settlers lost in the mountains after dark. Running Bear's first instinct was to remain hidden, to let them pass by. Their troubles were not his concern. Then he saw them in the dim moonlight, a young woman, hair falling loose from what had once been a neat bun, her dress torn and muddied. She clutched the hands of two small children, a boy and a girl, both thin and clearly exhausted. "Please, Thomas, just a little farther," the woman was saying, her voice breaking with fatigue. "We need to find shelter before the storm." The boy, perhaps 8 years old, nodded bravely, though his face was streaked with tears. The little girl, younger still, simply cried silently, her tiny feet stumbling over the rough terrain. Running Bear watched as the woman faltered, her strength clearly failing. The mountains would show no mercy to the unprepared, especially with a storm approaching. These three would not survive the night without help. He had lived alone for so long that the thought of interaction with others, especially white settlers, made his chest tighten with discomfort. Yet something in the woman's determined gait, in the protective way she held her children close, stirred something within him. Before he could reconsider, Running Bear stepped out from the shadows into the faint light of the moon. The woman gasped, pulling her children behind her in a futile gesture of protection. Her eyes, wide with fear, reflected the starlight. "Please," she whispered, "we mean no harm. We just need shelter." Running Bear stood silent, the Winchester held loosely at his side as rain began to fall. Rain fell in heavy sheets, drumming against the earth with growing intensity. Running Bear studied the woman and her children, noting their threadbare clothes, the hollowness in their cheeks, the desperation in their eyes. The little girl clung to her mother's skirt, her small face a portrait of terror as she stared at him. "Our wagon was taken," the woman explained, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Bandits. They took everything, our food, our supplies. We've been walking for 2 days." Running Bear remained silent, his expression unreadable. These were not his people. Their suffering was the result of their own kind's greed, their own government's broken promises, the same forces that had destroyed his tribe. And yet, the boy stepped forward, placing himself between Running Bear and his mother. Though his body trembled, his eyes held defiance. "Sir," he said with forced steadiness, "my sister is very cold." Running Bear looked at the child, so small, yet so determined to protect his family. It reminded him of himself many seasons ago, when he had stood beside his father, facing enemies far larger than himself. With a short nod toward his shelter, Running Bear turned and walked away, leaving them to follow or not. He heard their hesitant footsteps behind him, the mother's whispered assurances to her frightened children. Inside his shelter, built of stone, wood, and animal hides, the fire cast warm light on the sparse furnishings. Running Bear added logs to the flames, then moved to the far wall, creating distance between himself and the strangers. The woman ushered her children in, their bodies shivering uncontrollably. "Thank you," she said, her eyes meeting his briefly before looking away. "I'm Sarah Mitchell. These are my children, Thomas and Mary." Running Bear offered no name in return. Names created connections, and connections meant vulnerability. "You may warm yourselves," he said, his English halting but clear enough, "until the storm passes." Sarah nodded, guiding her children closer to the fire. The little girl, Mary, continued to stare at him, her blue eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The boy remained vigilant, his small body positioned protectively. "Are you hungry?" Running Bear asked, the question surprising even himself. 3 heads nodded in unison, a gesture that almost made him smile despite his reservations. He retrieved dried venison from his stores, along with a pouch of berries he had gathered the previous day. Not much, but it would ease their hunger. He placed the food on a clean hide near the fire, then retreated back to his position. Sarah hesitated before accepting the offering. "We're grateful," she said softly. "We haven't eaten since yesterday morning." As they ate with the desperate control of the truly hungry, Running Bear observed them more carefully. The woman's hands were soft, uncalloused, not the hands of someone accustomed to the harshness of frontier life, yet there was a strength in her movements, a determination in her eyes that spoke of resilience. "Where is your husband?" he asked abruptly. Sarah's face tightened with grief. "Dead. Pneumonia last winter." Her voice was flat, controlled. "We were traveling to my brother's homestead near Santa Fe." Running Bear nodded once. Death was a familiar companion to all. "I never had a wife," he found himself saying, the words emerging unbidden. "Never had children." The statement hung in the air between them. Sarah looked up at him, something shifting in her expression, pity, perhaps, or understanding. He could not tell which he disliked more. The girl, Mary, had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, her small face finally peaceful. Thomas continued to eat slowly, his eyes growing heavy despite his efforts to stay alert. Outside, the storm raged, lightning illuminating the mountains in brief, brilliant flashes. Running Bear knew that the path down the mountain would be treacherous for days, impassable for those unfamiliar with its dangers. These strangers were now his responsibility, at least until the weather cleared. The thought settled uncomfortably in his chest, like a stone he could neither swallow nor spit out. Morning arrived with gentle persistence, sunlight filtering through the smoke hole of Running Bear's shelter. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, glistening with raindrops that caught the light like scattered diamonds. Inside, Sarah and her children slept, huddled together on a buffalo hide that Running Bear had grudgingly offered them in the night. He had not slept. Instead, he had kept watch, partly out of caution toward these strangers, partly because the unfamiliar sounds of their breathing disrupted the silence he had grown accustomed to. The soft sighs of the children, the occasional murmur from Sarah as she dreamt, these were sounds his shelter had never known. Running Bear moved quietly, stoking the fire and preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal cakes. The familiar routine steadied him, gave him purpose amidst the discomfort of company. Mary woke first, her eyes opening suddenly as if startled. She looked around with momentary confusion, then found Running Bear across the shelter. Unlike the previous night, she didn't shrink away. Instead, she watched him with undisguised curiosity. "Good morning," she whispered, her voice small but clear. Running Bear nodded, unsure how to respond to the child. Children among his people were treated with affection and indulgence, but he had never learned how to interact with them properly. His own childhood had ended too abruptly. Sarah stirred, immediately checking on her children before acknowledging their host with cautious gratitude. "The storm has passed," she observed, moving to the entrance of the shelter to look outside. "The path down the mountain will be dangerous," Running Bear said. "Mud, fallen trees." Sarah's shoulders sagged slightly, but she straightened them quickly. "We don't wish to impose. We'll leave as soon as the children have eaten." Thomas, now awake, looked between his mother and the imposing figure of Running Bear with concern. "Mama, where will we go? The wagon is gone." The simple question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Sarah had no answer that would comfort her son. Running Bear handed out the cornmeal cakes, watching as the children ate eagerly. Despite his reservations, something inside him rebelled against the thought of sending them out unprepared. "Your brother," he said abruptly. "How far?" Sarah looked up, surprise evident in her expression. 4 days by wagon, when we still had one, on foot, with the children." She trailed off, the calculation too daunting to complete. Running Bear grunted, "Impossible alone." Their eyes met across the small space, an understanding passing between them. Sarah's pride warred with necessity. He could see it in the tightening of her jaw, the brief lowering of her gaze. "We have nothing to offer in return for your help," she finally said, dignity evident in every word. Running Bear shrugged. "I ask for nothing." Mary had finished her food and was now examining a small wooden carving of a bear that rested near her sleeping place. Her small fingers traced the detailed markings with wonder. "Did you make this?" she asked, holding it up. Running Bear nodded. The carving was one of many he had created during the long, solitary winters. A way to keep his hands busy, to pass the endless hours of isolation. "It looks just like you," Mary declared with the innocent conviction of childhood. Thomas snorted, then quickly covered his mouth, darting a nervous glance at Running Bear. For the first time in years, Running Bear felt the corners of his mouth twitch upward. Not quite a smile, but something close. "We should gather supplies," he said, turning to Sarah. "The journey will not be easy." Sarah's eyes widened. "You'll help us reach my brother's homestead?" Running Bear nodded once, already wondering at his own decision. This woman and her children were nothing to him, their problems not his concern. Yet the thought of sending them away, ill-prepared and vulnerable, sat like a stone in his stomach. 3 days, he said. "We will rest today, prepare, leave tomorrow at dawn." As he stepped outside to survey the damage from the storm, Running Bear felt something shift inside him. the first crack in the wall of solitude he had built around himself over the years. The day passed in a flurry of activity as Running Bear assessed what they would need for the journey ahead. His practiced eyes noted the inadequacy of Sarah's and her children's clothing, their thin-soled boots unsuitable for the rocky terrain they would traverse. Their pale skin, already reddening from exposure, would burn under the merciless sun. "These will not do," he said, gesturing to their footwear. From a storage cache built into the stone wall of his shelter, he retrieved soft deer-hide moccasins of various sizes, crafted during the long winter months when hunting was scarce and time abundant. Sarah accepted them with hesitation. "I don't know how we'll ever repay you." Running Bear shook his head. "Survival is not about debt. It is about using what is available." He demonstrated how to tie the moccasins properly, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy. Outside, he instructed Thomas in gathering specific plants, those that could soothe blisters, ease thirst, or be eaten in times of need. The boy listened with intense concentration, his earlier wariness giving way to genuine interest. "Like this?" Thomas asked, holding up a small plant with jagged leaves. Running Bear nodded. "Good for pain. Remember its shape." Mary followed them, collecting smooth stones and interesting leaves, occasionally presenting her findings to Running Bear with solemn importance. Each time, he accepted her offerings with equal gravity, examining them before returning them to her growing collection. Sarah watched from nearby as she mended their tattered clothing with sinew and bone needles Running Bear had provided. There was something about the way the tall Apache moved, a fluid grace, an awareness of everything around him that drew her eye repeatedly. When he demonstrated to Thomas how to move silently through the underbrush, his patience with the boy's clumsy attempts touched something deep within her. John, her late husband, had been a good man, but had little time for teaching children. He had been too consumed with the daily struggle of frontier life. As midday approached, Running Bear led them to a small stream not far from his shelter. There, with practiced efficiency, he fashioned a simple fishing trap from reeds and willow branches. Thomas watched in fascination, attempting to mimic the skilled movements. "My pa tried to teach me fishing," Thomas said, the words coming out in a rush, "but he got sick before I could learn proper." Running Bear paused, studying the boy. "Your father watches your learning now," he said quietly. "From the place beyond." Thomas's eyes widened. "Do you really think so?" Running Bear nodded solemnly. "My people believe our ancestors walk beside us, even when we cannot see them." Mary, who had been collecting pebbles nearby, approached and slipped her small hand into Running Bear's much larger one. The gesture startled him, but he did not pull away. "Is your family there too?" she asked with childish directness. "In the place beyond?" Sarah began to admonish her daughter for the personal question, but Running Bear raised his hand slightly. "Yes," he answered simply, "my father, my mother, my brothers." His voice held no self-pity, only statement of fact. Mary nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Then you must be very lonely here." The observation, innocent and piercing, hung in the air. Running Bear did not answer, but something flickered across his face, a momentary unveiling of the pain he carried. By evening they had gathered and prepared enough provisions for several days of travel. Running Bear showed Sarah how to fashion a carrying sling for the youngest child, should Mary's legs grow too tired. "You know much about children," Sarah observed as they worked. Running Bear tied a knot with particular care. "I watched the mothers in my tribe before the soldiers came." The simple statement contained volumes of loss. Sarah's hand moved as if to touch his arm in sympathy, but she stopped herself, uncertain of the boundaries between them. That night, as they sat around the fire eating the fish caught in Running Bear's traps, the silence between them was different, no longer tense with suspicion, but softer, filled with the beginnings of understanding. Dawn broke, with fingers of pink and gold stretching across the eastern sky. Running Bear had risen before first light, checking and rechecking their provisions. He had spent the night outside his shelter, allowing Sarah and her children the safety of the enclosed space. Sleep had come fitfully, his mind unusually active with thoughts of the journey ahead. Sarah emerged from the shelter, her hair neatly braided, face set with determination. Thomas followed, attempting to mirror Running Bear's stoic expression. Mary came last, clutching the wooden bear carving that Running Bear had silently placed beside her sleeping form during the night. "We're ready," Sarah said, though her voice carried a tremor of uncertainty. Running Bear surveyed his shelter one last time. Never before had he left it for so long. The thought that he might not return sent an unexpected pang through him. This place had been his refuge, his fortress against a world that had taken everything from him. With a short nod, he shouldered the heaviest pack and led them down the narrow mountain path. The going was difficult from the start. The storm had left the trail slick with mud and littered with fallen branches. Running Bear moved with the sure-footedness of one born to the mountains, but Sarah and her children struggled. Mary slipped repeatedly, once nearly tumbling down a steep incline before Running Bear's quick hand caught her arm. "Perhaps I should carry her," he suggested, noting the child's exhaustion. Sarah hesitated, then helped Mary into the carrying sling Running Bear had fashioned. The little girl's weight settled against his back, her small arms wrapping trustingly around his neck. "You're tall as a tree," Mary whispered near his ear, a note of awe in her voice. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly. Running Bear led them to a shaded clearing beside a small spring, where they could rest and replenish their water supplies. As Thomas eagerly explored the perimeter, Sarah sank onto a fallen log, massaging her blistered feet. Running Bear silently offered her a poultice of crushed herbs. "Your husband," he said as she applied the medicine. "He took you west without preparation." It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. John had dreams larger than his knowledge. Her voice held no bitterness, only a weary acceptance. "He believed my brother's letters about the opportunities in Santa Fe. When pneumonia took him, continuing west seemed the only option left." Running Bear nodded, understanding the desperate logic of her decision. "And these bandits who took your wagon?" Sarah's hands stilled. "3 men. They appeared friendly at first, offering to help when our wheel broke. Then," she glanced toward her children, lowering her voice, "they took everything. Said we were lucky they were leaving us our lives." Anger flashed in Running Bear's eyes. "You remember their faces?" "Yes," she whispered. "Every detail." He nodded once, filing the information away. These mountains were his territory. Strangers passing through rarely escaped his notice. If these men remained nearby, he would know. As they continued their journey that afternoon, Running Bear found himself increasingly alert to threats, not just from the terrain, but from potential human dangers. His senses, always sharp, seemed to expand to encompass the 3 vulnerable lives now in his care. When a rattlesnake crossed their path, he dispatched it with silent efficiency before Thomas even registered the danger. When Mary grew too tired to continue, even in the carrying sling, he fashioned a small travois from branches and hides, pulling her behind him without complaint. That night, they made camp in a small cave Running Bear knew from his hunting expeditions. As Sarah tucked her exhausted children into improvised bedding, Running Bear stood watch at the entrance, his silhouette sharp against the darkening sky. "You've been alone a long time, haven't you?" Sarah asked softly, joining him. Running Bear didn't turn. "Alone is safer." "Is it?" She gazed at her sleeping children. "I've never felt more unsafe than when John died, and I was left alone with them to protect." Something in her words resonated with a truth Running Bear had been denying. Alone wasn't always safer. Sometimes it was just alone. The second day of their journey brought them down from the high mountains into a landscape of scattered pine and juniper. Running Bear moved with increased caution, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. This transitional territory was known to attract those seeking to avoid the law: deserters, outlaws, men with nothing to lose. "You're worried," Sarah observed quietly as they paused to rest near a rocky outcropping. Running Bear nodded curtly. "We approach where your wagon was taken." Thomas, overhearing, pressed closer to his mother. Mary, oblivious to the tension, had fallen asleep in the travois, one hand still clutching her wooden bear. "We can go another way," Sarah suggested. "No, this path is fastest." Running Bear's jaw tightened. "But we must be careful." As they continued, the silence between them grew heavy with unspoken concerns. Running Bear found himself listening, not just with his ears, but with every sense he possessed, the way his father had taught him long ago. It was Thomas who spotted it first, a thin column of smoke rising above the trees, perhaps a mile ahead. "Is it a town?" the boy asked hopefully. Running Bear shook his head. "No town here." He motioned for them to remain still while he crept forward to investigate. Sarah pulled her children close, her face pale with renewed fear. From his vantage point behind a cluster of rocks, Running Bear observed the small camp below. 3 men lounged around a fire, their horses tethered nearby. A wagon, sturdy and well-built, stood to one side, loaded with various supplies. Something cold settled in Running Bear's stomach as he recognized several items that seemed out of place among the rough belongings of frontiersmen. A woman's shawl draped carelessly over a saddle, a child's wooden toy discarded in the dirt. He returned to Sarah with his findings. 3 men, a wagon. He didn't need to say more. Her sharp intake of breath confirmed his suspicion. "The bandits," she whispered, her hand automatically moving to shield her children's ears. "What do we do?" Running Bear considered their options. Confrontation would be dangerous. Going around would add days to their journey through terrain even more challenging than what they'd already traversed. As he deliberated, Mary awoke, rubbing her eyes. "I'm thirsty, Mama." Their water supply was running low. The spring Running Bear had planned to refill lay beyond the bandits' camp. "We wait until dark," he decided, "then pass by silent as shadow." Sarah nodded, though fear remained etched on her face. As they waited for nightfall in the shelter of a shallow ravine, Thomas whispered to Running Bear, "Will you teach me to move silent like you, so I can protect Mama and Mary?" The simple question, asked with such earnestness, struck Running Bear deeply. He remembered asking his own father the same thing many seasons ago. "Yes," he answered solemnly. "It is good for a man to know how to protect his family." "I'm not a man yet," Thomas said, doubt creeping into his voice. Running Bear studied the boy. "Among my people, a boy becomes a man not by years, but by accepting responsibility. You already carry this for your mother and sister." Thomas straightened his shoulders at these words, pride replacing uncertainty. As twilight descended, Sarah moved closer to Running Bear. "Were you always alone?" she asked softly. "After your tribe?" Running Bear stared at the darkening sky. He rarely spoke of the past, but something compelled him to answer. "Not at first. My cousin Grey Wolf and I survived together for 2 winters. His voice grew distant. "Soldiers found our camp. He stood to fight while I hunted. When I returned, only bodies remained." Sarah's hand moved to cover his, her touch light but firm. "I'm sorry." Running Bear allowed her hand to remain. The simple human contact, so long absent from his life, sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. "It is the way of our times," he said finally, "but perhaps not always." Night fell like a heavy blanket over the land, stars emerging in a sky untainted by the lights of civilization. Running Bear had instructed Sarah to smear mud on her face and the children's to dull the paleness of their skin. Now, as they prepared to move, he studied them with critical eyes. "Remember," he whispered, "step where I step. No sound." Sarah nodded, her face tense but determined. Thomas mimicked her nod, standing as tall as his small frame allowed. Mary, who understood only that they must be very quiet, pressed her finger to her lips in solemn promise. Running Bear had dismantled the travois, unwilling to risk its dragging sound. Mary would have to walk or be carried. He shouldered their packs, distributing the weight to minimize noise, then led them out of their hiding place. The moon, just past half full, provided enough light to navigate but also enough shadow to conceal their movements. Running Bear moved with the fluid grace of a mountain lion, each foot placement deliberate, testing for twigs or loose stones before committing his weight. Thomas followed admirably, mimicking Running Bear's movements with intense concentration. Sarah came next, one hand holding Mary's, the other occasionally steadying herself against tree trunks or boulders. They had covered perhaps half a mile when Mary stumbled, a small whimper escaping her lips before Sarah could hush her. Running Bear froze, listening intently. No sound of pursuit came, but his instincts prickled with warning. Wordlessly, he lifted Mary into his arms. The child wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face against his shoulder. Her complete trust humbled him, this small being placing her safety in his hands without question. They continued through the darkness, the bandits' camp now visible through the trees. The fire had burned low, but Running Bear could make out the shapes of the three men, two sleeping while one sat watch, occasionally sipping from a bottle. Their path would take them within 100 yards of the camp, too close for comfort, but the only viable route through the rocky terrain. Running Bear motioned for them to proceed with extreme caution. Step by careful step, they navigated the treacherous ground. Thomas had just passed a particularly challenging section when his foot dislodged a stone. It clattered down the slight incline, the sound impossibly loud in the night silence. The watchman jerked upright, peering into the darkness. "Who's there?" he called, reaching for a rifle propped nearby. Running Bear handed Mary to Sarah with a single urgent whisper. "Hide!" He pointed to a dense thicket of juniper. "Do not move until I return." Before Sarah could protest, he melted into the shadows, circling away from them to draw attention from their position. Sarah hurried the children to the hiding place, gathering them close as they crouched among the prickly branches. Thomas trembled against her, but remained silent, his young face set with determination. From their concealment, they heard the bandit moving through the brush, muttering curses. "Probably just a damn coyote," he grumbled, but continued searching. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Mary's small hand clutched Sarah's so tightly that her nails left half-moon impressions in her mother's palm. A sudden shout broke the silence, followed by the crack of a rifle shot. Sarah stifled a gasp, pressing her children closer to the ground. More shouting erupted from the direction of the camp, the other men awakened by the commotion. "Injun! There's an Injun out there!" a voice called. Sarah's heart froze. Running Bear had been seen. The rifle cracked again, the sound echoing through the night. Then came the unmistakable sounds of pursuit, crashing footsteps, angry voices. "Mama!" Thomas whispered, his voice strained with fear. "Will they kill him?" Sarah couldn't answer. The thought of Running Bear falling to these brutal men was suddenly unbearable. When had this Apache stranger become so important to them, to her? "We need to help him," Thomas insisted. "We can't," Sarah whispered back, though every instinct urged her to act. "We'd only make things worse." Another shot rang out, followed by a cry of pain. Sarah couldn't tell if it was Running Bear or one of the bandits. Mary began to cry silently, tears tracking down her mud-smeared cheeks. Sarah held her children and waited, helpless, as the sounds of violence continued in the distance. Silence finally fell over the forest like a heavy shroud. No more shouts, no more gunfire, only the occasional hoot of an owl and the whisper of wind through pine needles. Sarah remained frozen in their hiding place, straining to hear any sign of Running Bear's return. "We should look for him," Thomas whispered, his young face set with worry. "No," Sarah answered, though everything in her screamed to do just that. "He told us to stay hidden." Another hour passed, each minute stretching into an eternity. Mary had fallen into an exhausted sleep against Sarah's shoulder, but Thomas remained vigilant, his eyes scanning the darkness for any movement. A soft rustling sound came from their left. Sarah tensed, pulling her children closer. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness of the trees. "Running Bear," Thomas called softly. The shadow paused, then moved toward them with the familiar fluid grace that brought a surge of relief to Sarah's chest. Running Bear appeared at the edge of their hiding place, his face streaked with blood, his breathing labored but controlled. He carried a rifle that hadn't been his before and a pack bulging with supplies. "You're hurt," Sarah whispered, reaching toward a gash above his eye. "Not serious." He gestured for them to follow him. "We must move, now." "The men?" Thomas asked, wide-eyed. Running Bear's expression hardened. "They will not trouble anyone again." Sarah didn't ask for details. She woke Mary gently, gathering their few belongings. The child blinked drowsily, then reached for Running Bear with complete trust. After a moment's hesitation, he lifted her into his arms. They traveled through the remainder of the night, putting as much distance between themselves and the bandits' camp as possible. Running Bear set a pace that pushed them to their limits, stopping only when dawn began to brighten the eastern sky. In the shelter of a small canyon, they finally rested. Running Bear distributed food and water from the pack he'd taken, the family's own supplies, reclaimed from their stolen wagon. "You found our things," Sarah said, recognizing a small cloth doll he handed to Mary. Running Bear nodded. "Took only what was yours." As the children ate hungrily, Sarah examined the wound on Running Bear's forehead. "Let me clean this," she insisted, dipping a cloth in water. He submitted to her ministrations with stoic silence, but Sarah felt his eyes on her face as she worked. The intensity of his gaze made her hands tremble slightly. "You risked your life," she said quietly. "Why?" Running Bear was silent for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. "You asked if I was always alone," he finally said. "Yes, by choice, after Grey Wolf died. Safer that way." He looked toward Thomas and Mary. "But alone is not living, just surviving." The simple words carried such weight that Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. She finished cleaning his wound, letting her fingers linger briefly against his temple. "Thank you," she whispered, "for helping us live, not just survive." Something shifted in Running Bear's expression, a softening around his eyes, a barely perceptible relaxation of his perpetual vigilance. Thomas approached, holding a strip of jerky. "I saved this for you," he said, offering it to Running Bear. "Mama says we need to keep up our strength." Running Bear accepted the offering with formal gravity. "Your mother is wise." "Did you kill those bad men?" Thomas asked suddenly. "Thomas!" Sarah admonished. Running Bear placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I protected what matters," he said simply, "as a man must do." And the answer seemed to satisfy Thomas, who nodded and returned to his sister. Sarah watched her children, now sitting together examining a small bird's nest they had found. They seemed different somehow, still children, but carrying themselves with a new resilience. "They're stronger than I realized," she mused. Running Bear followed her gaze. "Children adapt, like saplings in the wind." "And what about you?" Sarah asked softly. Can a man adapt after being alone for so long? His eyes met hers, and for the first time since they'd met, Running Bear smiled. Just a slight curve of his lips, but it transformed his face entirely. "Perhaps," he said, "perhaps." The landscape gradually transformed as they journeyed southward. The rugged mountains gave way to rolling hills, dotted with pinyon and sage, and finally to the flatter terrain that signaled their approach to the outskirts of Santa Fe territory. According to Sarah's calculations, they would reach her brother's homestead by the following day. The knowledge hung between them, unspoken but ever present. Running Bear felt it like a physical weight, growing heavier with each mile they covered. Soon, he would complete his promise. Soon, he would return to the solitude of his mountain shelter. The thought no longer brought comfort. They made camp beside a small creek, the water gurgling pleasantly over smooth stones. Thomas helped Running Bear construct a lean-to of branches and the tarp they'd recovered from the bandits, while Sarah prepared a meal from the supplies they'd reclaimed. Mary sat nearby, creating an elaborate village of twigs and pebbles, chattering to her wooden bear about its inhabitants. "And this is where we'll live with Running Bear," she explained seriously to the carving, arranging small stones in a circle. "And this is where Thomas will learn to hunt." Running Bear, overhearing as he secured the shelter, felt something twist in his chest, a sharp ache unlike any physical pain he'd known. As twilight descended, they gathered around the small fire. The days of shared hardship had forged a rhythm between them, a wordless understanding of each other's needs and movements. Thomas leaned against Running Bear's side, asking questions about the stars appearing overhead. Sarah watched them, her face soft in the firelight, as she cradled Mary against her shoulder. "My brother William is a good man," she said suddenly. "He has a large homestead, land granted after the war. His letters spoke of needing help with the work." Running Bear nodded, unsure why she was telling him this. "There would be a place for someone with your skills," she continued, her voice carefully neutral. "Someone who knows the land, who could help protect the boundaries." The implication of her words settled slowly. She was offering him a future different from the one he had resigned himself to, a future not defined by solitude. "Your brother would welcome an Apache?" he asked, skepticism evident in his tone. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "William judges people by their actions, not their heritage. He married a Mexican woman, despite the disapproval of many." Running Bear looked away into the dancing flames. Could he live among settlers, even accepting ones? Could he set aside the bitterness that had been his companion for so long? He glanced down at Thomas, now dozing against him, and across at Mary, her small face peaceful in sleep. Then at Sarah, whose eyes held a question she was too proud to voice directly. "I will consider it," he said finally. Later, as the children slept in the shelter, Running Bear sat beside Sarah at the fire's edge. The night was clear, a canopy of stars spreading above them like scattered diamonds. "When my husband died," Sarah said softly, "I thought I would never feel safe again. I believed I would always be just surviving." Running Bear understood completely. It was how he had lived for years. "But these past days," she continued, "despite all the dangers, despite everything, I've felt something different." She looked at him then, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Because of you." Slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, Running Bear reached out and took her hand, her fingers twined with his, warm and sure. "I never had a wife," he said, echoing his words from their first night together. "Never had children." He paused, gathering courage. "Never had family to protect." "And now?" Sarah whispered. Running Bear looked toward the shelter where Thomas and Mary slept, then back to Sarah, whose face held both vulnerability and strength. "Now I understand what my father meant when he said a man without family is like a tree without roots. His voice grew soft. "I begin to wish for roots." Sarah's free hand rose to touch his cheek, her fingers gentle against the scar that marked him. "Then perhaps it is time to plant them," she said. William Mitchell's homestead appeared on the horizon as the sun reached its zenith, a cluster of sturdy buildings surrounded by fenced fields and grazing livestock. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house, carrying the promise of hearth and home. Running Bear halted at the edge of the property, uncertainty suddenly gripping him. This world of white settlers, even kind ones, was not his. Perhaps it could never be. Sarah sensed his hesitation. "Come," she said simply, holding out her hand. Before he could decide, Thomas spotted a man emerging from the barn. "Uncle William!" the boy shouted, breaking into a run. Mary followed, her small legs pumping furiously. The man looked up, disbelief and then joy transforming his weathered face. "Sarah!" he called, rushing to meet them. "My God, we thought you were—" He broke off, sweeping both children into his arms. A woman appeared in the doorway of the house, dark-haired and olive-skinned, her expression one of astonished delight as she hurried toward the reunion. Running Bear remained where he stood, an outsider witnessing a family reunited. He could leave now, he realized. His promise was fulfilled. They were safe, yet his feet refused to move. William looked up, noticing him for the first time. The settler's expression shifted to caution, one hand moving protectively to Thomas's shoulder. "William," Sarah said, moving back to Running Bear's side. "This is Running Bear. He saved us when we were robbed. Without him, we would not have survived." William studied the Apache warrior, taking in his stoic expression, the rifle held loosely in his hand, the scar that marked his face. "Then I owe you a debt I can never repay," William said finally, stepping forward with extended hand. Running Bear hesitated only briefly before accepting the handshake. "No debt," he replied. "They have given me as much." The Mexican woman, William's wife Eleanor, as Sarah had explained, approached with warm hospitality, inviting them inside where food and rest awaited. As they walked toward the house, Mary slipped her hand into Running Bear's, looking up at him with complete trust. "You won't leave, will you?" she asked, her small voice carrying a universe of hope. Running Bear looked down at her, then at Thomas, watching him expectantly, and finally at Sarah, whose eyes held a question she was too proud to voice again. "I will stay," he said, the decision crystallizing even as he spoke the words. "For now." The days that followed carried their own challenges. William's neighbors viewed the Apache with suspicion at first. Some refused to visit while that savage remained. But William stood firm in his welcome, and Elena's family, longtime residents with connections throughout the region, gradually helped bridge the cultural divide. Running Bear built himself a small cabin on the edge of the property, needing solitude to balance the newfound companionship. Each morning he would emerge to help with the work of the homestead, mending fences, hunting game, teaching Thomas the ways of tracking and survival. In the evenings, he often joined the family for meals, gradually growing comfortable with their easy conversation and laughter. Mary insisted on sitting beside him, chattering endlessly about her discoveries. As autumn painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Running Bear stood with Sarah at the edge of a newly plowed field. William had offered him land of his own to cultivate come spring. "Do you regret it?" Sarah asked. "Staying?" Running Bear considered the question seriously, as was his way. In the distance, he could see Thomas helping William with the horses, and Mary collecting colorful leaves with Eleanor. "My father once told me," he said slowly, "that a warrior must know when one battle ends and another begins." His hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the ease of practice. "My battle with solitude is over," he said. "Now begins the battle to build something worth protecting." Sarah's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "We will fight it together," she promised. And Running Bear, who had once declared he never had a wife, never had children, looked at the family that fate had given him and knew he had finally found his way home.